Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics, and this is the Langdon Tactical LTT RDO. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls of all ages, someone has finally put a red dot on the Beretta and maintained a reasonable approach to backup iron sights. Optics keep improving in quality, but I don't ever see a reason to take the backup irons off of the gun. I'm also not a huge fan, for the most part, of dovetail mounting. And previously, because the Beretta's design kind of occurred long before red dots were considered a practical application to the handgun, your best option was dovetail mounting with some kind of plate system, which usually left you with a less than ideal, unsavory, a little bit ridiculous sometimes, iron sight, if at all. A lot of guys would just forego the rear sight altogether in order to introduce that dovetail mount, or you could use something like a Duick Defense, and I think Raven Concealment still makes one as well. And there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but it does set the optic much higher than I would like it to be, and I knew that all we needed was a man to apply some engineering, and it had to be somebody smarter than me, to apply some engineering to the Beretta in order to make it happen. The biggest roadblocks to developing this platform are the fact that the internal parts do not behave in a way that allows you to mill and mount a plate or an optic to the slide of the Beretta, until Langdon got fed up and did it. It's probably no secret to you by now, if you've been watching the channel for a little while, that I'm a huge Beretta fan. Almost unreasonably so, considering, arguably, of course, the advancements in firearms that have come along since the Beretta, but that same argument could be used for like the 1911. My point is, I have an irrational love affair with the Beretta handgun. I first fell in love with it when I carried it as a duty gun as a cop, and to this day it is still my favorite full-size 9mm handgun to shoot, even though without some aftermarket fine-tuning and correction of nuances, the Beretta can be a bit of a clunky center block to shoot. Even if it is accurate, it's heavy, it's ungainy, the double action pull kind of sucks, the single action pull has a lot of travel in it, and even though it's a full-size gun, it's got the grip of a compact, which is something some people prefer, me not personally. All that aside, it's still one of my favorite guns and my very favorite full-size 9mm, but I don't do iron sights anymore. The only time I shoot iron sights these days is literally to maintain the proficiency, or when practicing if my optic goes down and I use the backup iron sights on my red dot handgun. Ernest Langdon reached out to me some time ago and gave me kind of a sneak peek of what he was working on. And then, thanks to COVID here in 2020, I was originally supposed to go out and spend some time with him and get some actual hands-on in person. I wasn't able to do that, so we ended up doing the whole Zoom thing, because that's what everybody does these days, and he gave me the whole rundown on what I was going to be looking at when I received my slide. Thankfully, Ernest sent one out to me, so I didn't have to wait to buy one, and allowed me to put it through the testing process. Now, if you go a little bit deeper in the channel, it wasn't too long ago, I did a review on just the traditional Langdon Tactical LTT with his trigger job. That was the only aftermarket option I added to the cart when I did that. So for the purposes of this video, I'm really focused just on the mounting system, because the gun itself has already proven itself. However, because Ernest had to replace, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, some of the internal parts in order to get the optic system for the RDO to work as it needed to, I was going to be taking a hard look at those to make sure they maintain functionality and safety. Now, the RDO is offered as a complete package, or you can just order the slide, or you can send your Beretta in and have the work done. When you do that, you're going to get some re-engineering. It's not as simple as just milling out a pocket for the optic platform, or the optic shoe, if you will. There are some parts that had to be re-engineered to make this function. The firing pin block had to be, well, changed, because like I said earlier, their design did not support the idea of a red dot coming along down the road, because the design is considerably older than that, becoming more practical. The extractor pin, safety levers, and safety plunger also had to be slightly modified in order to make this system work. It comes as a default as a G model, which is my preferred Beretta. It's a decocker only because I don't see any reason to have an active safety on a double action gun when the hammer's down. And of course that's a personal preference. But one of the selectors, or I should say decockers, is slightly smaller than the other just to accommodate the overall geometry that needed to exist in order for this to take place, because there's not a lot of room to work with on that part of the slide on the Beretta. Now this is obviously something that Beretta could have done themselves. It's their gun. They hire engineers that have a job to engineer things. So Beretta very easily probably could have put a little bit of time into this and made it work from their end, but it didn't seem like there was a lot of generated interest from Beretta themselves to make this happen. So Langdon did it. The question, of course, is going to be, with these changes that had to be made, which these parts that are now different, are we going to encounter any reliability or, more importantly, safety issues? Of course, running my LTT RDO through my normal 2,000 round review process, the very first thing I'm going to do is the burn down. 500 rounds through the firearm as quickly as possible to see if that accelerated volume of fire, almost unrealistic if you will, volume of fire, is going to create any issues you wouldn't otherwise see shooting the same amount of rounds in a much longer period of time. So without further ado, here's your burn down. Warm. Being an all-metal gun, the LTT RDO got a little spicy for the grip there towards the end. However, first to last round, I didn't encounter any issues as far as heat building up and causing problems. Overall, the performance getting into that first 500 rounds, because I zeroed it and immediately did the burn down, the performance is exactly what I'm looking for, meaning I have a red dot that doesn't sit ridiculously high. And like that seems to be a very small wish list, but it's the most important factor of putting a red dot on a handgun. I don't want to have to make things more complicated, more difficult in order to get the desired result. So I have a Beretta with a red dot that has iron sights there if I need them. The only kind of finicky thing that I don't really care for is the fact that it's iron's rear, which I don't personally care for. I can shoot it either way. I just prefer my rear sights to be forward of the optic for other reasons. I've done a video specifically on that topic if you're curious. After the 500 rounds, I started using the Beretta as I would normally use it, just working it into my own personal practice. Even though I do shoot a lot of striker fired guns, I still appreciate the Beretta as something to work on, because mastery of a double action pull, no matter how smooth and aftermarket-y, if you will, that double action pull is, it's still a double action pull. So I liked incorporating that gun into various drills in order to maintain that skill, just because, for whatever reason, I feel like I should. For drop safety, one thing that I do on any gun that I review, I usually don't film this because it's not sexy, but I'll just take primed casings, dummy rounds, if you will. So there's no powder, no bullet, and I'll load the gun and I'll drop it. Now, on the Beretta, I dropped it on the hammer, dropped it on the side, dropped it on the top, did a bunch of drops, and no negligent discharges, no accidental discharges. Safety features worked as intended, which is important because Ernest had to replace some of those from what the factory OEM specs are in order to make the plate system work. The next thing, of course, is the optic system itself. I gotta drop it. As much as I don't want to, I have to, because I have to make sure that not only safety's been achieved, but if the optic takes a significant hit, is it going to lose zero? Because if it's so fragile that it loses zero, then it's not worth the trouble. No matter how much I love the fact that it exists, if the optic can take even a minimal impact and lose zero, that was going to be a big problem for me. It's going to be a deal breaker. Also, I want to see if dropping it from shoulder height, as I do with every optic and every optic mounting handgun platform that I test, is going to cause any issues with internal parts being fragile and causing breakage. And remember, going back to this, Ernest had to redesign, re-engineer, and produce replacement parts in order to make the system work. So are those parts now more fragile? So every 500 rounds, I do a shoulder height drop test on the hardest surface I can find, which is usually flagstone or concrete. So checking this out, what we're going to look at is a 5-round group I fired at the zero distance of 25 yards before the first drop test. And then I dropped it. And then we have another 5-round group fired after the final drop to make sure the zero is maintained. Which actually, this is something that I do after every single drop test, but show you the last one to confirm, did it maintain zero? So the big boxes have definitely been checked. Not only did it maintain zero, I didn't have any safety related issues, no breakages, no part failures. The gun continues to function exactly as it's supposed to function. In fact, if you didn't know the red dot was on there and you shot the gun, it would be like, that's how this Langdon LTT performs. I don't feel any functional difference in controls, trigger behavior at all, just because we've got re-engineered parts introduced into the gun. So that's kind of a small issue. And in the grand scheme of things, the parts that he had to re-engineer, it sounds like a lot, but they're very simplistic parts. And as long as they're engineered to exacting tolerances, they're gonna function as they do in a gun that doesn't have an optic on it. So just a traditional Beretta, they're behaving exactly as they're supposed to. And Langdon's appreciation for the Beretta is something that appeals to me because he knows of the little intricacies and nuances that are present in most Beretta models and licensed copies that are out there, and he's done absolutely everything over the past however many years to kind of melt those edges and smooth things out. And now we have a red dot on a Beretta. There will come a time when the 1911 and the 2011 is eclipsed by some other romanticized firearm from the days of yore. Is that going to be the Beretta? Maybe. Could be a CZ just as easily. There's a lot of guns out there that have, like I said, a romantic appeal to them like the 1911 and the 2011 do. We've gone out of our way to keep those guns relevant, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you think about it, but it's something that we like to do as human beings. And I don't think the Beretta's any different. I think the Beretta gets a lot of bad rap, and I don't understand why. Well, actually I do, because I've seen military Berettas. I've touched and played with military Berettas, and I understand why people in the military would get out of the military and talk bad about them. Same thing applies to a lot of other guns, though. Military doesn't necessarily take care of their guns like they should, because they tend to clean them for time filler, instead of actually when they need to be cleaned. The bluing's not supposed to come off. You're not supposed to shine the bolt carrier group, so on and so forth. You've been in the military, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We literally clean guns to damage them to that point. Do you need this? If you're a Beretta fan, if you're even Beretta curious, then absolutely. If you're a red dot fan, you're red dot curious and you're Beretta, and those two things align, then this is the gun you need because it's the only one out there. But it's not great because it's the only option. It's great because it was done right. Ernest probably could have released this a long time ago, and he didn't, I think, because he wanted to put in the time to make sure that the system was great. So nothing I did to this Beretta during my 2,000 round review process is something he didn't do to it. But I still wanted to approach this as objectively as possible and put in the work. I had an expectation of it being awesome, but I was fully prepared for something to break, something to fail, something to go wrong. Nothing did. Everything was simple, intuitive, from mounting the optic to zeroing the optic. Tolerances are extremely tight. And this is something that appeals to me greatly. Now, this particular gun defaults to an RMR footprint. So if you don't have an RMR footprint optic, you got to get one in order to mount one on. If he's going to offer other footprints in the future, I don't know. I think that's probably going to be largely dependent on the popularity. But the cool thing is you don't have to buy the LTT. Like I already mentioned, you can send in your Beretta. There are a few variants of the Beretta that can't be done. You can find that on Ernest, the Langdon Tactical website, to see which models are not available to have the optic RDO milled into them. But for the most part, if you're a full-size Beretta guy, you're going to be covered. There's just a few variances that unfortunately can't be done, but that just gives you a good excuse to buy the complete gun. And if you don't own a complete Langdon Tactical Beretta, then you're really missing out. So now I have the best, so far in my experience, the best variant and the best aftermarket model of the Beretta available, and I have an optic on it, and I'm able to maintain my iron sights, and I don't have to have some kind of Jeffrey giraffe neck length in order to get my dot, because I had to use a dovetail mount on a gun that sits relatively taller sight-wise than some of the other guns that are out there. Just buy it. In fact, if you hate Berettas, buy this so you can change your mind. I can't think of any reason why anybody who has the ability to own one should not own this gun, because it's, well, and this is me being completely irrational because of my romantic love affair with the Beretta, it's awesome. And I highly recommend that everybody get one, because it was the best way to exercise what a lot of us had been dreaming for a very, very long time. And I personally would like to thank Ernest Langdon, for doing it for us, because we couldn't do it for ourselves. I'm Aaron Cowan with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly.